All right, so we are now into the 1920s, and we're going to talk about some of the broader cultural changes that were taking place, as well as some of the more specific strategies that emerge in this era and become popular, and some of them continue to be popular to this day. So, one thing that we really see happening in the 1920s is, more so than at any time before, this is a distinctly modern period. And when people talk about the term modern, often we just think of that, well, that means what's happening now or what's just recently happened. But modernity is a term that refers to this time when populations, both in Europe and North America, were increasingly concentrated in the big cities and in industrial societies. So it isn't just this movement starting, as we talked about before, but in unprecedented levels, those populations are now in these urban centers. And also, though, important for us, people's ways of thinking about what the future is going to be have really changed. So this is a period where there's dramatic technological change all around them, not just the fact that you're working in factories and building something rather than living on a farm, but all kinds of technological change throughout people's lives. There's also a kind of optimism in general about the future and how things may be better. And so being modern is about being a more modern future, a better future, excuse me. At the same time, however, there is this sort of anxiousness that exists in the culture about the changes that are happening and whether or not they're for the best, as well as the social upheaval that is taking place in terms of large populations moving here and there. In the case of the United States, there's a lot of immigrants, for example, and just what that means about people's lives. So in some ways, a continuation of what we've talked about before in the general cultural currents, but increasingly an emphasis on modernism and being modern versus this nostalgia about the past and the Victorian way of life. I'm going to show you a couple of ads as examples. Here is one for Ivory Soap. And this is interesting because you can see the headline here says, "How Youth Debunked Clothes and Living." And on the left you see a very sort of Victorian notion of being fancy and elaborate. And then on the right, this is the modern woman. It's a very different style. And what's interesting about this, of course, is they're selling soap here, but this isn't about the soap itself so much as it is distancing yourself from the past and being modern. As well as, one of the things that's interesting, I think, is that you see youth is a force in itself. Youth is this thing that demands change. Youth debunked this old way of clothes, this old way of living. And if you were to be able to read the opening of this ad, what it says is, youth demanded simple clothes instead of those fussy, elaborate styles of the 1900s. Clothes more expressive of youth's own slim, natural grace. Clothes easier to wear in the 1001 activities of modern women. So this is a theme that we'll return to throughout this unit, the idea of the modern woman and how the modern woman is different from the past. None of this former Victorian fussiness, as this ad puts it. Here's something in a different realm. Now, this is another soap ad, right? This ad, however, is not targeting this sort of daintiness and fashion. This is Lifebuoy Soap, which is pretty notorious for some of the techniques they would use in terms of being sensational and the need for people to buy soap. We'll see them in the decades that come. So here we have, a very different approach. And you look at this headline, "Crowds Breed Contagion." And, we've got a mixture of people here in this crowd. And some of them we might aspire to be like or identify with, and others we distinctly would not, right? Like, for example, this guy at the very foreground who is clearly, down on his luck sort of guy. And the small type that's describing the scene says, "How many typhoid Marys are in this crowd? Thousands of perfectly well people are unknowingly carriers and spreaders of disease." So here, this is tying the need for this product to just the basic situation of living in cities and not even knowing when you're surrounded by disease and when you have to protect yourself, right? Who knows which one of these? Maybe it's that guy that looks like he's down on his luck and working hard, or maybe it's, one of these ladies in the nice hat. You can't really know when you're amongst the crowd. Okay, so moving on now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some critical history work that's been done on the advertising industry in the 1920s. One of the most famous scholars of advertising culture is named Roland Marchand, and he's written about how you can look at this advertising from this period as a kind of social tableau, and that is that it often creates a setting for us that is symbolic of social expectations and ideas at this time. Now, the thing is, though, that doesn't mean that what we see in these images is how people actually lived. Rather, they're a kind of aspirational model, right? What people at this time aspired to be able to consume. Like we've talked about earlier, with our illustrations of high standards of living and so forth. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind, however, is that the people producing ads weren't just like the people that were, the viewers or consumers of them, and in very, very distinctive, important ways, they could be very different, right? So, in terms of the advertising agencies and who worked for them, they really were a kind of elite. These agencies were in New York, they were in Chicago, and the people that worked at them differed from their consumers in terms of their class, in that largely they were more affluent than the consumers were. Their gender, they were overwhelmingly men, even though women, of course, were the ones that did the majority of household purchases. Their geographic locations, like I said, they were in the big cities, a relatively few number of big cities. And because of that, their tastes in culture, in cultural entertainments like music and live theater and things like that, and film even, were different from the masses of consumers. So, they are often creating an idea that's going to be aspirational in a sense, and is also their ideas of what people would aspire to. Rather than, again, this is just underscoring when we look at these things, this is not telling us that this is what the consumers of these products actually lived like. Rather, this was the aspirational models that were dominant at that time. Now, despite those differences that existed, one thing Marchand points out is that these advertising men were still distinctly modern individuals. That is, they are used to dealing under a kind of demands from exterior forces, that being clients, as well as time crunch and the kinds of accelerated living that were very much characteristic of this modern age. And they were not just modern humans, but they were indeed modern men. Like I said, overwhelmingly, people who worked at advertising agencies were men. However, not all of them were. And in fact, you have a reading this week that is about women working in the J. Walter Thompson Agency, one of the most famous of all advertising agencies and still exists to this day. And that's a great article for seeing how they went about finding women to work there and what life was like for them. There's also this very important individual, Helen Rezar, who's known for bringing a more feminine approach to sales, and in fact adding a kind of sex appeal from a female perspective to advertising, more so than had existed before. So, we've been looking at soap ads, and soap is obviously very important throughout the history of advertising. And here in this Woodsbury ad, which is famous, and actually may or may not be in your book, I'm not sure. The ad is just suggesting a skin you love to touch, right? And it's the woman and a man who loves to caress her hand. And the target here is going to be the woman herself, but there is a sense here of this contact between them. It's if not sexual, it's very sensual. So her ads suggested sex appeal quite often, and also they were still in line often with these aspirational model of aspiring to these lifestyles of richer people. So you see people in very elaborate dress and so forth, in ads that are for these basic, relatively inexpensive products like soap. Another one of your discussion forums that you're going to do this week has to do with J. Walter Thompson's Modernizing Mother campaign, which is a famous series that they did for Modus feminine hygiene products back in the 1920s. And what you'll do is you'll look at these ads, and each thread is going to have a different ad to look at. And you'll see that in these ads, they're all about the daughter educating the mother. How do you be modern, Mom? And so what I want you guys to do in those discussions is to look at what are the kinds of words, what are the kinds of values and adjectives that are associated with the mom and then with the daughter who's modern, and how is the daughter going to overcome her resistances and make her modern, which of course means getting her to buy these modus women's hygiene products versus the old way of doing things.